Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sports Talk with Tonsoni, a special edition. I am your host, Brian Tonsoni, and with me today, donating his time, is Connor Hope, who writes for Fansided's Busting Brackets, and he also does some writing for Wingspan Sports. We had a conversation last year when it came to bracketology. Connor does a lot of work. He is located out west, and through the incredible technology we have today, we're able to talk a little bit about journalism. Connor, how are you doing this evening?
Doing well, Brian. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. And Connor, share with our students, our audience, what kind of writing you do.
Okay. Well, first off, right now I'm doing, obviously you mentioned I'm writing for Busting Brackets and writing a little bit about college basketball there, as well as some NFL, Major League Baseball, college football stuff for Wingspan Sports. Um, it's not my full-time job. I actually work in the tech industry, but it's just a way for me to kind of get my ideas out there. I mean, outside of my work, sports is my number one interest. So I started writing about 2 years ago now, and have built myself a modest little readership base. So.
What was the most challenging thing for you as you started into your writing a couple years ago?
Honestly, for me, it was just getting back into it. In high school, I wrote for the school newspaper. I was the editor for the sports section there for a year, and kind of fell out of it when I went to college. But yeah, it's just getting back into it and really finding my voice. I think that's probably the toughest thing. You try and start off emulating other writers, but you really want to kind of hit your groove, find your niche, and really find your voice. And the way you write should reflect who you are.
So what is your niche? What is your style that you try to bring out through your writing?
Honestly, it's for me, it's finding that one key piece that I can really hone in on. I know a lot of people when they're doing things such as game reviews or previews, they try and encompass everything. For me, it's finding that one key matchup or that one key event that kind of set the tone for everything. I try and keep things short and sweet and really focusing on what's key without really getting too far into the details of it. But yeah, I mean, it depends on what I'm writing. How I write rankings is going to be different from how I write kind of game previews is going to be different from how I write post-game reviews. So it really depends. But for me, it's trying to keep things short and sweet and really focusing on the key factors.
So you're talking a lot of game previews and reviews. Do you do any feature writing along the way?
I do. A lot of it tends to be just kind of rankings. So I just wrote my Western Athletic Conference rankings or my Mountain West rankings. I do, once the season starts, write a few features. Last year, one of them was, how good, Pacific could have been in the WCC. Early this offseason, I wrote a feature on Jack Williams' transfer from Pacific. Things that I'm kind of a little bit closer to, I tend to write features on, and things that are a little bit further away, I tend to try and leave that to the people who are a little bit closer to that. So
one of the things we're attempting to do with Delphi Bracketology and the new website Sports Talk with Tonsoni is start to do some game reporting. Purdue University just got back with us, and a couple of our sponsors have been credentialed to go to the Purdue Northwestern football game. I was lucky to get credentials to go to the Purdue Michigan basketball game. Once we figure it out as the sponsors, we're going to start bringing students with the expectation that within 24 hours, 48 hours for high school kids to write a game review of the game that we attended. What kind of things do you do when you're writing a review of a specific game that are important for you as a writer and important for your readers?
First off, don't try and give a play-by-play analysis of the game. Those tend to be long. People who are reading them, a lot of them have already watched the game, so they know kind of what happens. Find the angle you're going to take and go with it. So if it's say it's an Indiana-Purdue game and Carson Edwards comes up with a big steal that kind of changes the momentum of the game, and Purdue wins. From a Purdue perspective, you can write about how that moment in the game switched the momentum and the things that happened because of that momentum change. Whereas if you're writing from an Indiana kind of perspective, you can write about the things that went well before that moment. So what were the positives that came out of that game, even in a loss? And if you're writing from an overall kind of more objective perspective, you're not writing from a perspective of either side, just kind of go into the key factors of the game, whether it's how Indiana matched up against Carson Edwards, or how well the freshman for Indiana did, or some of those things, key factors from both sides that can be taken, where fans of both sides or people who aren't fans of either side can kind of take those and run with them. I mean, that's kind of in a nutshell how I do it. I don't try and focus on every play that's been made. I kind of focus on the key factors, the positives and the negatives, or one key play that might have defined how that game went.
So would you suggest then in your note taking, whether it's on computer or tablet phone or on notes, just trying to locate those key parts in a game, and then depending on deadline, looking through those notes and finding the unique angle based on that as we're sitting in a press box?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's how I do it. If I'm watching, it's different depending on the type of game I'm watching. If the game is back and forth the entire way, I might try and focus a little bit more on how it ends. And it might take me a little bit longer to get out my review. But if it's, say, a Gonzaga versus Portland game, where Gonzaga's winning by 25 the whole way, but I notice a few things early on, I might be sitting there taking my notes, kind of setting up my outline before the game ends, because the end of the game really doesn't define the game. Whereas in a barn burner, something it's going back and forth, you really want to stick to the end and figure out why one team won over the other. So I think it's a delicate balance. If you are sitting in a blowout, it's really easy to get that written before the game ends. But if you're sitting in a game that's going back and forth, you can have key things that you notice, but you can't really write a review, for me at least, until it's ended.
So post game, depending on whether you're writing on a game that you're watching on site or off site, let me go back to this. This was the question that came up. How important is it to do your legwork ahead of time? So when you're covering two teams that you cover and you're watching the game, or you're at the game covering the game, how important is it to do your research ahead of time to know who plays, the rotations, the styles, because that might, I think, then lead to an angle while you're watching the game?
Oh, I mean, it's very important. Last year, I was at the PK80. I was watching the Gonzaga Texas game, and I had already known that Gonzaga struggled against the press. I didn't realize that Texas was going to use the press so heavily. But yeah, I mean, if you go in with the legwork, you go in with the key factors you're looking for in the game, a lot of times the outcomes will kind of align with those key factors. So everyone knows that a team that's playing Purdue is going to have to deal with Carson Edwards. Everyone knows that a team that's playing Gonzaga or Kansas is going to have to deal with their front court. And so you kind of have those matchups, those areas of focus that you're looking at. If you're looking at a heavy freshman rotation, you're going to look at how they evolve over the course of the season. But then you also want to go in with an open mind. So once you get your notes on that, you want to look at things that may pop up that you might not have expected or you might not have thought about. So if a team that usually runs a man-to-man is running a really good zone defense, for example, you might want to write on that, their ability to be versatile on defense. You might not have thought about that going in, but if you have what you're looking for going in, it makes your ability to watch the small things a little bit easier.
That makes a lot of sense. Last year, when again, I'm an Indiana guy, but I live 20 minutes from Purdue, so that's an interesting place. But I was able to go and watch Isaac Haas, and I thought throughout the whole season how teams defended Isaac Haas was something to watch. Were you going to double team him? Were you going to let him get his points? Or are you going to lock up on the 3-point shooters? So that, I think, would be an example of going in prepared to watch that. And then if something else pops, then you can go with that. What kind of deadlines do you have, and how do you handle when you're coming up against deadlines, whether it's that evening of a game or a day later? How do you handle deadlines as a reporter?
Honestly, it's just about making sure that you give yourself enough of runway. For us, game reviews tend to be, we tend to finish them that night, and then they're released the next morning, depending on where it is. So since I'm on the West Coast, mine tend to be released AM on the West Coast, where a review for the East Coast is probably going to be released in the morning on the East Coast. And honestly, it helps a lot to lay out a framework before you start to write, and just give yourself enough time. Don't wait till the last minute. I know a lot of writers try and wait till the last minute to write, and if you do that, a lot of times you're not going to give yourself enough time to self revise, which I find I always write and then do a once over before I send it to the editor. Frameworks are a lot more important to get done ahead of time than the actual writing. So if you have a framework done, sometimes I'll do a framework on the weekend and then I'll write on a Thursday. It makes your writing, it kind of guides your writing makes it a lot more fluid.
Do you have, let's kind of go back a question. Do you have a key resource for your statistics to find out information about the teams you're covering? Or do you use a variety of sites to find out information about Gonzaga and Pacific and how they're doing and what their 3-point percentage is? Do you have a go-to site?
I go with Sports Reference. So if I'm looking for statistics from the previous season or the current season or even the last 10, I go to Sports Reference. It becomes a little tricky when you're looking for overall like head-to-head records and rivalry matchups because Sports Reference only goes back to like 1950. So any game before that's not any result before that's not going to be captured. But yeah, Sports Reference tends to have the most up-to-date data. They tend to be correct. Sometimes I'll look at the box score of a specific game to make sure that it's right, but Sports Reference tends to be what me and the other writers at Busting Brackets go to.
Post game, if you're on site, how important is quoted material from players and coaches, or is that something you don't use an awful lot? Or, well, we'll just leave it at that. How important is quotes in your game reviews?
Because I'm not a full-time writer, I tend not to get quotes. There have been times where I've been able to get in touch with some players about kind of more featured pieces, but I don't usually get quotes post-game. The way I write tends to be more from an analytical perspective. How did it go? I don't try and determine the effort level or how the players felt or what the atmosphere was, especially for games that I don't attend. But if you're writing a piece and you want to incorporate the flow or the atmosphere of the game or what things were particularly frustrating for the other team, quotes can be a really great way to capture that.
Is it easy for those times when you do include, talking to players and that about those types of articles? How easy have you found it to get in touch with sources for your articles?
It depends. Certain players are a lot more open to speaking. Certain players are not. Certain coaches are a lot more open to letting their players interview with reporters. Certain coaches are not. It really just depends on the program and the person. Some coaches don't want their players saying anything in a non-structured environment. So, outside of like a press conference, just because they want control or they want to make sure that their players are in an environment that won't allow them to say something that might be twisted the wrong way. So, but some players are open books. It really just depends on the player.
Are different universities rules like going through sports information directors or whatever to set up, or is it frowned upon to do direct contact with athletes?
You always want to go from the site or publication you're writing for. You always want to go through them, and they'll go through the communications department. You never want to. Sometimes, like, I mean, I have a friend who plays for Rice, and sometimes I can contact him directly, but I never use quotes that he's given me or information he's given me outside of a structured environment.
We're talking with Connor Hope of Busting Brackets, who's given us his time on a Monday evening to share some journalism. And in this podcast, we're really focusing on game reviews, game previews, which is what Connor writes a lot, and what we are going to be doing on our Delphi Bracketology site and also on sportstalkwithtonsoni.com. So, Connor, this has been a great conversation here. What is your biggest struggle that also young writers might face that we can kind of give them a little bit of a heads up to try to avoid?
Honestly, it's reception. I mean, sometimes you'll think that your idea or your opinion or your take is spot on, and you know, people will take one thing you said and use that as your whole argument, or they'll, you know, take one thing and try and use that against you. So really, it's anticipating what people might say about your arguments and responding to them in advance. So I always try and think, well, if I say, you know, one thing, they might come back and try and dismiss it, or try and say that it doesn't matter, or try and say something else overpowers that in terms of an argument. But really, it's reception, because, you know, there are days where everyone agrees with what you write, or everyone loves what you write, and there are days when people take it and try and use it as an example of bad writing, or try and use it as an example of someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. You just gotta be prepared for that, brush it off. I know a couple of writers at Busting Brackets have had issues with that the past couple of weeks. So, I mean, really just keep plugging along, because there's always going to be those crazy fans that don't like what you say, and you got to remember that that's your opinion. They have their opinion, and you can't let them dictate what you write.
That's interesting. I'm in education and providing authentic audiences, because I believe it builds better results. Kids pay attention to their writing a lot more when they know people might see it. But the downside of authentic audiences is getting a comment or two from somebody who doesn't like what you wrote, or the typical, if you write something about Team A and the fans don't like it, you automatically hate Team A, when you're probably being an objective, you know, writer about Team A. And we've all seen what has happened with the official from Kentucky, the Kentucky fans, and I forget the name of the official. He's a pretty well respected official, but his business was kind of attacked online by Kentucky fans who didn't like his calls. So I think that's the unfortunate part of your of writing. I'm glad that you brought it up. We're approaching our 20 minutes here, but the digital world right now is so prevalent. Does that affect the style of writing, and it might even affect how people see and react? As you mentioned, the reception piece, it's so much easier to complain behind a phone or a digital device, as opposed to in the old days when you had to read it in print. But does the digital platform aid or hinder how you write your stories?
I would say it kind of affects it a little bit, in the sense that when I was writing for print, when I was writing for my school newspaper and stuff like that, my writing style tended to be a little bit, I wouldn't say more advanced, but it tended to be a little bit longer in development. I think in the age of the internet, in the age of Twitter, in the age of Facebook, where everything's short, people get to the point. If you draw out those sorts of articles in an online digital platform, Some people may tune out. But I mean, on the same token, the internet helps you get your name out there. It helps you spread your writing. It helps you spread, make connections with people that you wouldn't have otherwise made connections with. And it helps you interact with people who actually take your writing, will give you their feedback, honest feedback, whether it's good or bad, and have discussions with. I always, once I have my framework, I try to get, 2 or 3 other people who I respect, just to bounce the idea off of, or certain things off of. That way that I'm not forgetting anything. So it kind of makes it a little bit shorter because, I mean, in the digital age, people have a little bit shorter of an attention span. But other than that, I think the internet has helped massively in spreading, especially independent writers and writers who don't write for big publications.
Yeah, and I think those very writers sometimes do not get a fair analysis from some of the veteran broadcasters and writers as well. There is really good content being delivered by many writers across the country, and your explanation of the digital connected world, you and I wouldn't have connected 20 years ago. Right. I would never have, I don't know. We're a small rural school, and we have some good followers on the bracketology site. And I've been, really pleased with how the journalists and the people in the bracketology world, the basketball world, share, information and must follows and connect from one coast to the Midwest to the East Coast. And I do think that's a vital thing. Really pleased to hear about the length of articles in digital, because that's one that I was wondering if you call me an editor or the person of that. Is there do you operate, you said framework, is there ever a minimum length, word count, or is it just depend on the angle and the story that you're taking?
It really depends on the angle in the story. We try and keep sections or certain topics of a story. So say you have a multi-topic story. We try and keep that, 250 to 500 words. We try and keep stories in general, in terms of reviews or previews or whatever, from 250 to 500 words. Keeping them short and sweet and to the point. It doesn't need to be some long prose. It just needs to be, informative, or enough to get your argument across in an effective way. I think it's a really good way. It's made it a lot easier for people to get their arguments across.
That's some good stuff. Connor, we appreciate you taking 20, 25 minutes here this evening to talk to students you've never, ever met, and to a guy that we've only talked to twice. Again, I think your comment about the digital world is important in writing, and I'm going to probably clip that piece and send it to some of my educators as well, because I think it's awesome. It's incredible in education as well to be connected with people and experts across the country, and there's a lot of people out there willing to help. So I appreciate you taking the time. Share again with our listeners the conferences that you cover and where they can find your work.
So I'm expanding what I cover. Obviously, every year you try and explore new things, dive into deeper topics, expand your knowledge, expand your coverage. But really, for Besting Brackets, I focus on the Pac-12, the Western Athletic Conference, the Mountain West, the West Coast Conference, the Big Sky, and the Big West. So those 6 conferences out west of the Rockies. And for Wingspan, I mean, I cover pretty much everything: Major League Baseball, NFL, college football. Again, I try and focus on the West Coast, but as a New York sports fan, sometimes my writing dives into New York sports. And yeah, you can find me at Busting Brackets. You can find my work on Wingspan Sports. And I mean, really just if your students need any help, or they want to get their work out there, their writing out there, let me know. I'd be happy to help. I'd be happy to spread the word. I try, and because of people have helped me get to where I am, and get to the reach that I've had, it's always a good thing. I try and do my best to help others get their feet off the ground, because it can be really tough when you only have 30 followers on Twitter or 30 people reading your piece to have the confidence or the self-confidence to keep doing it. But I'd be more than happy to share anything they write, just because the more people talking about college basketball, the more people talking about sports in general, the better.
Well, you have gotten yourself into an expert on the West Coast for Delphi bracketology, and we plan to have you on several times throughout the basketball season on Sports Talk with Tonsoni to help us build that bracket and hopefully another winning bracket. I consider you a friend and look forward to talking with you and having great conversations in the future.
All right. Thanks, Brian. Have a good one.
And that'll do it for another edition of Sports Talk with Tonsoni. I'm Brian Tonsoni for Connor Hope. I say so long.